Welcome to Workforce Wednesday, the Social and Emotional Intelligence in Corrections, Part 2, with Jennifer McNabb. She's an adjunct faculty AL and corrections instructor. My name is Olga Scamilla, and I'm going to be your host. Now I want to introduce our presenter today. We want to welcome Jennifer McNabb. Jennifer has almost 13 years of experience working in the correctional facilities as an educator. She has 6 years with a jail psychoeducational program for women prisoners dealing with trauma and addiction as an instructor, program developer, and trainer of volunteers and instructors. She developed and ran a peer mentoring program for 17-year-old prisoners at Dallas County Jail. She has over 6 years working with Dallas College's correctional education programs. She specializes in life skills classes that provide students with soft skills for the workplace and reentry. She's a doctoral candidate, all but dissertation, at Southern Methodist University in the Simmons School of Education and Human Development, specializing in prison studies. So without further ado, I want to welcome Jennifer. Thank you for being with us today, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Olga. And hi, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Welcome to Workforce Wednesday, Social and Emotional Intelligence in Corrections, Part 2. Just to orient you to what we are going to talk about today, you'll notice that this is Part 2 of Social and Emotional Intelligence Corrections. I did Part 1 in another session in January. And I understand that this session is now available in the PD portal if you want to go and look for it. And in that session, I outlined the core components of a course that teaches soft skills for the workplace in the correctional environment. So Part 1 focused on content, and Part 2 today will examine the elements of teaching practice that support such a course. All that I present here could really be part of teaching practice in any adult education setting, but I will argue that the elements I discuss here are especially important in the correctional environment because of the features of that environment that are different from classrooms on the outside. So just as a reminder, I will refer sometimes to social and emotional intelligence as EQ, just for short. It's a little bit of a mouthful, so EQ. When I say that, that's what I'm talking about. And also just be aware that I will pause for questions at different points in the presentation. And so please put any questions into the chat, and Olga will certainly help me track the chat. So first of all, I'd like to know about who's in the room. I'd like to know a little bit about your interest in corrections education. So if you would take the poll and just note whether you're an administrator, an instructor, an outside instructor wanting to learn a bit more about being in the correctional education setting, or an employee of a correctional facility, or something else, just so that we get to an idea. Well, that looks like that we've got quite a few administrators, we've got a number of instructors, and the rest of you are others. Of course, I'd love to find out what those other things are, but we will have to move on with the presentation. Maybe I'll find out in the chat later on. Okay, thank you very much. We will now move on to getting into the meat of this presentation. So the goals of the session today are twofold. First of all, I want to contextualize the prison as a teaching environment. As I mentioned earlier, I'm promoting these teaching practices for the prison environment in particular. So I want to talk a little bit about the features of this environment so that I can explain why I feel my approach works best in this environment. And then we'll get into examining the teaching practices that align with the principles of social and emotional intelligence tailored to the correctional learning environment. So first of all, let's look at the prison as a teaching environment. And I should say the basis for this part is not just my 13 years experience as a teacher in prisons and jails, but also I am also a prison researcher. And so this is also based on what I know of other people's research and my own research in the prison environment. And this is a particular area that I'm interested in, is the prison environment and how people experience that environment while they're in there. So prisons, you have a lot more limited resources in correctional facilities, and anybody that teaches in prisons and jails knows that they're restricted in what they can bring in. So, for example, pens even. You can't assume that your students are going to come to the classroom with their own materials, and you also have to check what materials you're allowed to take in. Some facilities, for example, don't allow you to use staple documents, so you have to come up with a different way to put pieces of paper together. You can be teaching in spaces that are cramped, underheated, under air conditioned, or overheated or over air conditioned. I've certainly learned to layer over the years when I go into these different facilities. Also, you're not going to be using technology very often. Rarely do you have access to technology in correctional facilities. And usually you don't have access to the internet. Although I will say that in the last year, during the pandemic, some jurisdictions have decided to allow internet access so that online learning can take place, because they realize the value of programs. And obviously prisoners have been largely without programs for this last year. So I think we have to be aware that these facilities are built to house people in secure conditions. They haven't been built with education in mind. And so your teaching spaces are not necessarily spaces designed with education in mind. And you're also very likely to experience a lot of noise and interruptions. And then your access to your students is limited to classroom time. So this means that it's hard to meet with students one-on-one. There are no office hours like we have on the outside for instructors and students. And so this has to be addressed in other ways, and that's something I'm going to talk about during the course of the presentation. There is a hierarchical command and control environment within prisons, and there's an overall hierarchy in the prison environment that has staff and corrections officers higher in the pecking order than prisoners, obviously. This also means that information travels in one direction from the top down. If someone higher in the pecking order, higher in the hierarchy tells you to do something, you do it. You don't have a discussion about it. Within the prisoner segment of the prison population, there's also a pecking order. And prisoners have different statuses depending on things like whether they are housed in honor wings. This happens in some jurisdictions. There's also prisoners have trustee status, which means that they have certain duties within the prison that gives them some extra privileges, maybe fewer restrictions. And then there are certain prison jobs that have higher status than others. And this all relates to the next feature of the environment that I've called respect versus depersonalization. People with low status want to raise their status. This is actually just part of being human. And so this is often achieved in prisons according to a version of respect. There is a certain respect etiquette in prisons that is particular to that environment. And I could go into lots of details about that, but that would involve another presentation, so I won't do that right now. But the rules about respect on the outside, particularly in workplace cultures, I think we can safely say are largely different from those inside prisons. And so as an instructor, it's important for the instructor to establish certain norms about how students and instructor and students show respect for one another during the classroom. And this is a good way to sensitize students to what they can expect in a workplace environment. And it starts to begin to get them used to a different kind of culture. And I'll be talking about this further on in the presentation too. Another reason respect is so important is that becoming a prisoner is in and of itself a depersonalizing experience. You're a number rather than a name. You wear the same clothes as everybody else, and your life is stripped down to the basics. And since prisoner status or ex-felon status is a permanent identity post-release, instructors must become aware that they're dealing with this dynamic among their students within the prison. Some of the teaching practices that I will talk about later will actually relate to this in more detail, this issue of status. And this also relates to my next point, that you are dealing with students with damaged life histories and identities. And this permanent loss of status and the stigmatizing identity of ex-felon is hard to overcome. And you'll find that many of your students have not just been into prison once, they've been in and out of prison. So they're very well aware of this. And also, despite these tough exteriors that you sometimes see projected, particularly by male prisoners, I think you have to hold in mind that their status makes them vulnerable, even though they would probably be the last people to admit it. And then finally, students often have limited, unrealistic, or fantasy-based notions of their lives beyond prison. As instructors that are working on helping our students develop their educational and vocational skills, we are very focused on their futures. And so it's important for us to be aware of how students themselves see their own futures while they're still in prison. Depending on how long they have been incarcerated, whether they've been in jails, prisons, previous incarcerations that they've had, their personalities, life circumstances, such as addiction issues or mental health issues. Depending on all of these things, and probably plenty of other things, prisoners can be overly optimistic about their lives post-release or overly pessimistic. And I think that one of the roles of an instructor is to help our students come up with realistic ideas of what they can expect post-release, help them steer that middle ground. And in the part one of this series, I did talk a bit about a re-entry plan that is based on social and emotional intelligence that complements the kinds of re-entry plans that they might develop with social workers, counsellors, or parole officers. And this helps, this other plan that I suggest in the other session helps them with this middle ground that they need to aim for in their ideas about their lives post-release. Now let's take a look at this graphic here. It shows an EQ framework that I use for my classes. And if you look at part one, you'll see that I use the same framework for course content. And now I'm going to interpret this framework in terms of teaching practice and mindset. So as you can see that I've got mindset and practice here, and also the goal of turning insight into action as sort of guiding principles. And these are sort of around the 4 components of EQ. So you'll see in this inner circle, we have self-awareness, self-management, relationship management, and social awareness. In the top right quadrant there, you will see self-awareness, which is the foundation of the other 3 components. So if I have to be self-aware, I have to know what makes me tick. I have to know how I work before I can manage myself. So I don't know what I'm managing if I'm not self-aware. So it's the foundation of me managing myself when I'm in my classroom setting. It's also the foundation of my social awareness, my ability to be aware of things like the way my students interact, their personalities, their strengths, their challenges, and so forth. And it also helps me manage my relationships with my students. Looking outside the inner circle, you see mindset and practice. The instructor's mindset governs all aspects of learning, classroom experience, choices about what and how to present information to students, ways of thinking about social interaction, ideas about what kinds of people prisoners are, for example. All of these things come from mindset. And it's you need to be aware of what your mindset is because it directly influences how you show up in the classroom. Teaching practices will always reflect mindset. The emotionally and socially intelligent instructor is also alert to insights as she goes through her classes about how and what she's presenting and how students receive it, and about what is working or what is not working and why. And when an instructor has insights, she's prepared to respond to them with action, such as being prepared to change plans in the moment, add something in further along in the course because you've noticed the students particularly need it. And this type of approach requires the instructor to be both flexible and humble in her teaching practice.
Jennifer,
Yes.
before we continue, we did have a question.
Yes.
How involved does the teacher become in the release plan?
Mm-hmm. Well, I talk about the release plan. The release plan is really something that counsellors, social workers, and probation officers get involved in. So the prisons, different institutions have different ways of preparing inmates for their release. So they don't think that there's necessarily one way of doing this. It depends on the institution and the jurisdiction. The re-entry plan that I'm talking about is something that I do in my classes. And if you check out part 1, you'll be able to see what the components of that plan are. But the goal is for that to really, it's for a particular course that teaches social skills for the workplace. And I use this social skills framework to look at what they need to look at in terms of social skills for their re-entry plan. So it's a complementary plan. So that's really the extent that I get involved in a re-entry plan with my students.
Thank you. I just thought that was interesting. And I mean, I could see having that re-entry plan, a teacher helping out, especially with if they're going to go into an educational setting once they are released, and setting up some of those contacts before release.
Well, it's not about contacts. It's about social and emotionally intelligent features of themselves that they need to be aware of. Things like how they're going to manage relationships, how they're going to manage routines. Imagining how will routines be different on the outside from what they are on the inside. Just on the subject of routines, prisons have very, very rigid routines. When students leave, they're going to have to construct their own routines, something that has been taken care of by the prison. And so that's one of the things that I try and highlight is this is much more the soft skills of re-entry, and it complements the course that I've been teaching. And so I'm not giving them contacts because, for example, where I've been working, a federal prison, these prisoners are going back to multiple different states. And I don't know what all the contacts are in all those states. That's something that their managers within the prison, their re-entry people in the prison are going to help them with. So I certainly don't get into that kind of aspects of re-entry. Okay, I'll just start talking about the 2 concepts that guide mindset and practice in teaching practice. And the first is appreciative inquiry, or AI, and the second is egalitarianism. So appreciative inquiry, or AI, is a concept that originated in the academic discipline of organizational management. And you can see that I have cited it down here. That was back in the 80s. And these researchers, Cooper-Ryder and Srivastava, assumed that it is simpler to expand the positives than to eliminate the negatives, which always makes me think of that old Bing Crosby song. I hope I'm not showing my age here, but you know that song, accentuate positive, eliminate the negative, latch onto the affirmative, and don't mess with Mr. In between. Well, this is a nice way of summing up this concept. These researchers felt that this approach was especially effective in organizations in crisis, as a matter of fact. And you'll see if you start searching on the internet that the AI concept has migrated into other fields such as positive psychology, coaching, education, and leadership studies. Just as Cooper-Ryder and Srivastava advocated focusing on strengths of organizations and ignoring or at least de-emphasizing their deficits, instructors can adopt this same approach with their students. AI is basically strengths-based, purpose-driven, and future-oriented. Egalitarianism can be interpreted in many ways, but these are the 3 aspects of egalitarian teaching practice that I focus on in my classroom. Now, the first is power sharing. Rather than maintaining the distance and the power differentials that are in the hierarchy that is in the whole environment of the prison, the instructor looks for opportunities to allow the students to exert more autonomy and certainly exercise leadership within the classroom. The second one focused on others as well as self. That means that decisions in the classroom are based on the common good rather than purely individual advantage. And this approach promotes a much wider range of strengths as valuable. It also prioritizes humility and transparency. For example, the instructor models openness to feedback from the students and is transparent in justifying what she does when the students ask. So first of all, I'm going to look at mindset, and I'm going to look at it through the lens of the 4 components of EQ. So let's first of all look at AI mindset in relation to the instructor's self-awareness. So this means that she reflects on the strengths she brings to the class. She reflects on her purpose in teaching this class in this setting, and she reflects on hopes and goals for the class. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. I'm a person that thinks by writing, so that I journal a lot. I also scribble all over my lesson plans. You know, I make notes after class, I make notes before class. And another way of doing it, instructors, I think, always benefit from developing a network of other instructors with whom they can discuss their classes and what they're doing in their classes. Even other trusted people that you want to talk about these things, but to talk about things like your strengths, your purposes, your hopes and goals for your teaching in general, or in your teaching in particular with particular classes. And then use these reflection points when you're writing your lesson plans, and also have them uppermost in your mind when you're teaching. Instructors' social awareness in terms of mindset is paying attention to the strengths of the group's dynamic, but also focusing on students' individual strengths, goals, and aspirations. So you've got to have this split screen perspective on the class all the time, the group dynamic and the individual. So you can ask yourself some questions, things like, what is this group's dynamic? Every instructor notices this. Every class is different, right? You definitely notice that there are different you have different experiences and different dynamics in every class that you teach. Ask yourself questions like, who are the extroverts and who are the introverts? How can I leverage leadership skills or leadership aspirations in my students in ways that will benefit the group? What are students struggling with? And how does it show up in the group dynamic? How can I address these struggles in affirming and effective ways? I remember one class I taught where after the first couple of class sessions, I noticed that all the extroverts were sitting on one side of the classroom and all the introverts were on the other side. And because in this EQ class on EQ that I teach, we do an introversion, extroversion, self-inventory. Once we'd done that exercise, I was able to start talking about introversion and extroversion, and I told the students what I'd noticed. And so this led to a very interesting discussion where the students sort of explained why they were sitting with the people they were sitting with. And it also led to me asking them, so if this is, your chosen seating position, when you do group work, let's try and mix it up a little bit. I'd really like the introverts and the extroverts to try working together. And this actually turned out to be a great learning experience because students got to practice their self-management skills. So the extroverts had to learn to hold back a bit, and the introverts had to learn to push themselves forward. And this was a way that there was more power sharing in the group because we were practicing sharing the air based on just that observation that I shared with the students. Then there's the instructor's self-management in relation to AI mindset. And the instructor recognizes the need to adjust management strategies according to the needs of different groups. So different groups have different needs and different combinations of knowledge, expertise, and learning styles. So I would say for this, be prepared to adapt. An AI mindset is also a curiosity mindset rather than a judgmental mindset. And this notion is based in mindfulness. And I'm sure you've seen that. People are talking about mindfulness everywhere, and very much so in the workplace these days. One definition of mindfulness practice is non-judgmental noticing. So when you notice something going on in the classroom between you and a student, among students, whatever it is, instead of judging it, you ask a question. So why is this happening? So ask questions rather than making judgmental statements is a good guide for that. Also, instructor self-management involves being patient about waiting. If you work in corrections, you must be prepared to wait. Waiting is something you do a lot of. Everything happens according to the routines and rhythms of the institution, not to do anything to do really with your individual rhythms and routines. And then instructors' relationship management. This fundamentally means that the instructor believes that the prisoner students are better than and greater than the worst things they've ever done. In the correctional setting, much depends on seeing the student as capable of change and full of potential, and finding explicit ways to communicate these sentiments to your students. If you can adopt this mindset, your students will perceive it in your behavior towards them, and they're more likely to engage in class and do the work necessary to succeed. Now let's take a look at AI in practice. So what kind of practices support AI in your classrooms? So using open-ended questions that focus on students' strengths. So one way I do this is when I review written work, in terms of the content of written work, rather than just make corrections, I ask questions. And I have an agreement with my students. It's a norm that I set up at the beginning of class, where I am prepared to go back and forth with students. I ask them questions about their work, and my goal is to prompt them to clarify or extend or correct their work in response to my questions. And in that way, they can increase their grade. I'm willing to increase their grade if they will put the work in. And I've had students maintain correspondences with me sometimes over certain pieces of work that they've turned in. But if they're willing to continue with this and they do improve the work, I'm willing to proceed with it also and raise their grade. I had one student who is memorable. His name was Rex. I went through about 6 rounds of questions and answers with me, only to discover that he had not read the assignment thoroughly. And this is why he kept missing things. And actually, that was a very good experience for him, because in reflecting on past work experiences, he realized that that was something that had tripped him up in the past. He glossed over details. He didn't read things properly before he engaged with them, and that led to some mistakes. And he even went as far as to tell me that that was at the root of one of the reasons why he was convicted of a crime. His crimes were white-collar crimes. So that was a very good learning experience that resulted from that practice. And then you can I also invite my students to give me feedback in class by asking open-ended questions at the end, doing a weekly assignment, a journal assignment that I do. It's a guided journal assignment, so I ask particular questions, the same questions every week, but students then respond. And one of those questions is, what can you suggest that will improve the class? What have you noticed this week that you want to talk about? And so one student in one of these assignments, memorably, gave me some critical feedback on my listening behavior. Listening is one of the things that we tackle in this EQ class. He observed an interaction towards the end of a class that particular week in which he said I appeared to hurry the student I was listening to by trying to interpret what the student was saying. And I wasn't really listening in the way that I've been talking about listening. So I chose to share this with the class. And I told them, that I thought about why I'd done it that way. And I said that I realized that I was coming to the end of the class session. I had one eye on the clock. And so I was thinking, I'm not going to get through this. And I was hurrying the student. So I said to the students, so if you were in my shoes, what would you do? What would you have done? And so they said, it would have been better if I had just been up front and said, we're running out of time. I don't really have time to fully listen to what you're telling me right now. I wonder if we could continue this tomorrow. And so that was me allowing the students to give me feedback, sharing it with the class meant that I was modeling being open to feedback, which is absolutely essential if you're going to improve your skills in EQ. And I also was being clear about the fact that I'm fallible, that this business of learning to listen well is not something that is just a one and done deal. It's a thing that you keep on having to practice and that you slip up from time to time. And if you're willing to accept feedback from your peers, you get better at it. So framing perceived challenges as areas with growth potential. I think it's very important to say up front, I give my students a warning that they're going to be doing things that are quite difficult. Sometimes they're going to be given readings that feel too hard for them. Sometimes they're going to be having to present their ideas in class when maybe they really don't like doing that. They don't like standing up in front of people. Redoing an assignment sometimes feels a bit tough to do. People don't like doing it. But I emphasize that these uncomfortable things, these hard things, of where the learning occurs. I also provide time for students to seek help from me, and also I try to pair students with others who can provide help to them. And this is I'll tell you another story about another situation in class where this sort of was actually an illustration of that particular point. I often have students in my classes who are not native English speakers. And it is a problem because I find that students don't like to let on that their English isn't as good as they'd like it to be. Very often they speak good English, but their written skills are not so great, and their reading skills are not so great. So a few years ago, I had a young man, his name was Hector, who came up to me a few sessions into a course and said, I don't think I'm going to continue with this course. I think I'm going to drop it. So I asked him a little bit. I tried to prod him a bit to find out what was going on. And he actually confided in me that he didn't read English too well and he didn't write it very well. And he just felt like he just didn't follow things very well in class sometimes. And he also found the homework quite difficult to do. So I asked him if he'd just stick with me and see if I could come up with a way of helping him. And so I then, the next day, addressed the class. And I asked, first of all, I said, how many people speak languages other than English in the class? And most people said that they only spoke English. But there was, in this particular class, there were a number of native Spanish speakers, and there was also one native Vietnamese speaker and a native Urdu speaker. So then I said, this is actually quite a difficult thing to do, I just want to say, I said to them, because, if you're learning about something in a language that's not your native tongue, you're going to have to put in extra work. Obviously you are. It's going to be harder. And I also shared with them that I had lived in foreign countries and that I had also been in that position myself. And I could say, yes, it's definitely hard. So I said to the students who didn't speak English, who only spoke English and that English was their native tongue, if they were learning in another country the kind of things that we were learning in this class, what would they need to help them? And what they said was that they would need extra time for assignments. They would need to be able to say when they weren't able to follow things. They would need to be upfront with the instructor about that. And that they would like ideally to have someone with them in class that could help them work through some of the class projects that we did. So from that time onwards, because I talked about this business of learning in another language as difficult and therefore commendable that these people were even trying to do this, I sort of raised the status in the class of this business of learning when your native tongue was not English. It became a bit of a badge of honor that these people were working hard at learning in a language other than their own. And it gave me permission to also pair these students with people that could help them. Seeking help no longer became something that they could be ashamed of. They actually felt good about doing that. And actually, my student Hector did stick with the class, and he actually worked very hard on all of his assignments and actually learned to use an English dictionary. I could see the painstaking work he was putting into his written assignments, and he really did very well in the class overall and felt very good about sticking with it, and also got a lot of support from his fellow students. Another part of AI practice is helping students devise manageable, realistic goals. I find SMART goals really helpful here. And, SMART goals, S stands for specific, M for measurable, A for action-oriented, R for reasonable, and T for timely. And so this means that you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do so-and-so. You've really got to say, you've really got to be able to say how you know that you've reached the goal. It has to be measurable. You have to give yourself a bit of a deadline. It has to be based in time. And it has to involve an action. It can't just involve, I say I'm going to do it. It has to involve an action that shows that you're doing it. And it has to be very specific. It can't be just very vague. So SMART goals are very helpful for that. And also focusing on the process of change as much as the potential outcomes of change. And so, you can get too goal-oriented without thinking, so what steps have I got to go through to achieve that change? And so that gives you a blueprint for change for future situations when students learn the processes, their own personal processes of change. And so the how It's just as important as the what when it comes to that. And SMART goals are actually really, really helpful for that too. So SMART goals in combination with a focus on the how of change as well as the what of change will help students with finding that middle path between either the inflated optimism that some of them have or the overly pessimistic attitude to what their lives are going to be like once they leave prison. So let's just move on to egalitarian mindset. So what is the egalitarian mindset from the point of view of self-awareness? Well, it's a willingness to examine and question preconceived ideas about one's role in the power dynamic in the classroom. So ask yourself, how much class time do I spend talking? How much class time do my students spend talking? What are the boundaries of my expertise and where can my students contribute in this regard? Am I a sage on the stage or a guide on the side? And also be clear about one's leadership style and be able to justify it through an egalitarian lens. Ask yourself, what kind of a leader am I and how egalitarian is my style? I've included some leadership, some links to some leadership resources in the resources section, which I'll go over shortly, but you'll find something there that's useful to read about educational styles of leadership and also leadership from an EQ point of view. And then the instructor's social awareness involves focusing on the power dynamic of the group. So as an instructor, you ask yourself questions like, which students dominate class activities and which students hold back? Why do I think this is the case? Remember the question of the introverts and the extroverts in the class that came up earlier in the presentation. How do students share the air? How do they share the workload in team activities? How do they interact in team activities? The instructor should be going around the room noticing these things. And when students disagree with each other, how do they work it out, if they work it out? The instructor's self-management from an egalitarian perspective involves being willing to develop self-management strategies that honor the views and attitudes of people who have suffered dishonor and stigmatization due to their crimes. So ask yourself, what judgments am I making about my students' performance in class? What assumptions am I making about my students based on their circumstances and their status? How do these judgments and assumptions show up in my teaching practice, and how should I manage them? We all have biases. This does not mean that you're a bad person. It just means you're a human being. But one thing about being emotionally and socially aware and raising your EQ in this area involves self-examination and being aware of those things, and then managing yourself accordingly. Instructors' relationship management involves developing healthy attachments to students that recognize, honor, and encourage their contributions and strengths, and also fostering a climate of mutual support within the group. So develop individual relationships with students and acknowledge their strengths and contributions, and also note the strengths of individual students and recognize them as part of a collective class resource. And we're going to talk about these things in more detail. So this is part of egalitarian practice. So I develop classroom norms in collaboration with my students, and I'm explicit about how I'm going to manage accountability as well. So my classes, I always hand my students some norms that I've written out. And these are ways, very often based in respect, that I was talking about when we were talking earlier, that we have to have some norms about how we're going to treat each other in the classroom setting. I also ask students why they think I've chosen these norms so that we interact with the norms a little bit. And then I ask them if they want to add any of their own norms. And I do include them. We vote on them, I include them, and then I retype up the classroom norms and I redistribute them so that we're all starting off from the same place. And I can honestly say this is a great way of getting everybody on board at the beginning, because I'm obviously showing that I'm open to their input on this. It's also another way of differentiating your classroom culture from the prison culture, which is one of the goals of teaching these kinds of courses. And then leverage students' leadership qualities to balance their input and control over group dynamics while finding ways to encourage other students to participate. So sometimes this involves speaking individually with students about how you'd like them to take part in certain class activities. And certainly it sometimes involves you talking to them about maybe some not so productive behaviors during class. One of my most challenging students was a student called Israel, who clearly had many strengths. He had leadership skills. He was very talkative. He was actually very good with words. He was an extreme extrovert, but he liked to be the center of attention and would sometimes dominate so much that other students found it distracting, and they were giving me that feedback. And so I needed to do something about that. And I ended up talking to his counselor in his drug rehab program. And his counselor and I had a conversation with Israel that was actually quite transformative. And Israel, after that conversation, he realized I was able to tell him all of his strengths that I noticed and how I thought it was a shame that he wasn't developing them more, and that I thought that we could work on that in class. And he ended up taking every class that I taught in the prison and frequently came back and visited me, and is probably one of my biggest cheerleaders. So that was a very positive experience. Include assignments in which the instructor has a participatory role that is equal to the students' roles. I often pair up with students when we're doing pair work. I take part in team activities, and I also do certain assignments that they do and share them with them. I provide opportunities for students to fold their own relevant expertise and experience into teaching and facilitation roles in my classes. I had one student who was just a grammar whiz, and I would get him to teach some of the grammar rather than me. I would sometimes do little call outs, really, like 15 minutes here and there on certain grammar things, like apostrophes, for example, which are consistently misused, I find. Well, my student Chuck used to do a marvelous little mini lesson on apostrophes, and he was also great at diagramming sentences and would make those classes fun for the students. In another class on entrepreneurship, another student I had done quite a lot of his own research on setting up a small business when he left the prison. And he knew something that I didn't. He knew about the resources within the prison library about that. And so I asked him to teach for 30 minutes one day. He developed a handout. I reviewed it, I typed it up, and he talked to the other students about the resources that he'd found and how to use them. So this was a way of using the students' expertise in my classes and folding it in. Egalitarian practice also involves providing egalitarian structures and processes for group work. I always give my teams or my groups assigned roles. So different people take on different roles, such as timekeeper, note taker, discussion facilitator. I always have someone in the group that makes sure that everyone in the group gets to air their views and that all views are taken into account. And I get students to make sure that they don't take the same role in every group activity, so everyone gets to experience those roles. Also, provide students with opportunities throughout the course to give you feedback on their learning experience, both as a group and individually. So this weekly journal that I've been talking about, this is something that my students do as part of this course on EQ. It's a guided journal, and this is also part of something that I do. I do the journal myself every week, and so the students see what I think about how the class went, and the students give me their feedback too, and I respond to it. And so that means that we have this dynamic going all the time where I'm giving input, but the students are giving input, and we're working out how we're going to use it all. It can sometimes get messy, but that doesn't mean that you don't do it. It actually is a very valuable tool in developing trust, bringing people's leadership skills to the fore, giving students choice about how to do things, and getting them to make decisions, which is something that they really need practice in an environment where they don't do a whole lot of that. Expect to justify your choices about the content and delivery of your classes to your students. The reflective journal that I provide to my students every week is a way that I do that. So I'm being very transparent about what my thinking is and how I want to conduct class. I also mention some of the suggestions that I've had over the weeks from other students and throw that out there as something that I might try. And so the other good thing about me doing that journal page is it models reflective thinking. And this is kind of the essence of this business of trying to improve our skills in social and emotional intelligence. We have to engage in reflective practices. And so I model that by doing the course. And they also see how much detail I go into. I don't just give one-word answers to these guided questions. I respond in full sentences. And so they get to know that that's what I'm expecting from them, because this is actually a graded assignment. So I often, just to finish, I often quote John Dewey, who said, "We don't learn from experience. We learn by reflecting on experience." And that really is a sort of a guiding principle too in these courses. And it's certainly one that I use in sort of my whole mindset and practice in terms of these classes. So then I'll just move on to the resources. And if anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat. But just to the stuff on appreciative inquiry, if you want to read that article that originated this, there is the reference. But also it's worth looking on the internet, just searching yourself. But I found this website here, Are You Asking the Right Questions, on appreciative inquiry, quite helpful. And then on using SMART goals in the classroom, this research sourced by Shapiro and Cuseo from AVID for higher education is excellent. They have several references where they suggest the use of SMART goals. And then, as I mentioned, I've got a couple of links here to leadership styles. The first one, leadership styles in education, and also 6 emotional leadership styles, so that you can think, it helps you reflect a little bit on your own leadership styles and how that translates to your teaching practice when you're teaching in the correctional environment.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Oh, you're welcome.
Great information. I love hearing, all about how you use these different aspects in your classroom and not only build upon your own skills, but help your students build theirs. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's been good being with you today.
We have a lot of thank yous coming through. Thank you for all the information, says Carol. Thank you, Carol. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the session. And thank you so much. And we'll see you again.
Okay, thanks so much for your support.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Krista.
Thank you, Christy.
And have a great afternoon, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.